Hello, everyone. Since we've done an episode on minorities, we wanted to have another expert's opinion. That's why we've met with Professor Vincent Doyle, Professor of Media and Cultural Studies, and we would like to have another opinion to bring the idea of minorities a little bit closer. And we want to start off with the question, how is racism nowadays portrayed?
Well, there is no general answer to the question of how racism in general is portrayed in general. And do you mean, if you're referring to what forms of racism exist in the media today, rather than how do the media portray racism, you're probably referring to the former.
Exactly.
All right. So if you're referring to how the media in particular settings are still engaging in racist practices of representation, I think you really need to look at the specific context, different genre, different media, different channels, different kinds of media. There is no general answer that I can give to that question. However, so let me attempt a general answer that might lead us to some understanding of the question, which is to say that that regardless of the extent to which the media has improved in its portrayals of minorities over the years, it is an empirical fact. For instance, in the United States, the context that I'm most familiar with, that the percentages, if you will, of representations that deal with minority groups has increased over the years, that the diversity of those portrayals has improved overall. But that said, there are still ways in which specific minority groups are still represented, tend to be represented, in ways that conform to various historical stereotypes. So we still see, for instance, an overwhelming number of Latinos in U.S. media represented as drug dealers. We still have blacks as criminals, overwhelmingly. We still have portrayals of women that don't reflect the diversity of roles that women actually play in society, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, some of those long-standing historical patterns are still with us, at the same time as there have been some improvements.
Okay, so we've also discussed in our new episode the idea of Young's 5 Faces of Oppression, be it cultural imperialism or powerlessness. Now, if we take powerlessness, for instance, or powerless minority groups, is there a way in which governments or any other authority can help these minority groups to stand out a little bit more?
Well, I mean, in this case, in this framework, powerlessness refers to the extent to which people who belong to minority groups tend to have less ability to autonomously exercise agency in their own lives. In other words, that often they are not the masters of their own decisions. They have people in authority over them pretty consistently. Young discusses this discusses this as one dimension in a series of interrelated dimensions of oppression, which he calls oppression, that is related to another dimension, which he calls cultural imperialism, which is more directly related to the questions of communication and representation that we've been discussing so far. So I'll focus on this one of cultural imperialism, which is the idea that as a minority group, you do not always control, well, almost never control the conditions under which representations of your group are made. You are consistently represented by others, by the dominant group, who tend to represent you in certain ways. Now, as I said in the first part of this interview, that some of those patterns have been changing and have improved over time. The dominant group is representing minority groups in the U.S. more responsibly than before, perhaps. But there is still that dynamic of oppressor and oppressed, or dominant and minority group. So that the dimension of cultural imperialism is still with us. There is still a way in which people who belong to minority groups have very little power to exercise control over the conditions of their own representation, and that's a form of powerlessness, to connect the two dimensions of cultural imperialism and powerlessness that your question was getting at.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. This was Professor Vincent Doyle, and we'll see you next time for another special episode with another expert's opinion.